Five. Oh, I've got dogs. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Well, kia ora, everyone. Welcome into The Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of The Hoon on the Kaka with Peter Bale in Hoon Bay. Co-host. How
Bernard,
you going?
it's very good to see. It's very good to see you in my sitting room, and that you could hear a dog barking a minute ago. Is one of my favourite dogs. It's my neighbour. His name is Hero, and he's a
Hero.
black lab which very nicely and very sensibly barks occasionally at jet skis. But he's a very loyal, thoughtful, intelligent dog who smiles with all his teeth out whenever I come near, which I like. I have
nice.
occasionally been allowed to take him for a walk.
Ah, good. What I want to see is him racing down and jumping into the sea to try to chase after the jet skis and grab them off.
That's a very good idea. That's an excellent idea. It's a bit of a cliff. I think he might. Yeah, he's a bit of an old dog, but he does guard his owner very, very, very well. That's lovely to have you in my front room. Although I'm sitting in my spare room and it's getting quite warm in here, and I feel as though I've been sent to my room. But it's very nice to have you.
It is warm.
At my place.
It is the end of a golden summer. I just think it won't.
Can we just
end.
not say it's the end, please?
No, true.
I really
it seems
don't
to be
like
going
it.
on forever. No.
Yeah.
And we've had
I
a
want it
heck
to
of
go
a-
on forever. Actually,
Yeah. And it may well do. We'll find out more about that in our climate chat with Catherine Dyer shortly.
Oh, exactly. That's a very good point, because I'm going to Nelson next week, and going to the Nelson Lakes, and I think that
boy.
lake that we've both been to together, Retuiti, only goes up. Only changes in temperature in the water by about 1 or 2 degrees maximum between summer and winter. So, I
It'll
will
be
definitely
fresh.
be taking my wetsuit. Of course, our friend Patrick Smelly is going there this week for the Wooden Boat Festival, or the Vintage Boat Festival. I, on the other hand, am accidentally going there when the Powerboat Festival is on the following week, which will mean that I will be able to hear. There's a very famous powerboat that used to race up and down when I was a kid, and it has a Merlin V12 in it from a Spitfire or a Hurricane, and it's when it's going full tit down from the head of the lake to where our place is. It sounds like either a Bristol freighter is about to land on the lake or a Spitfire is coming down. It's pretty impressive, but
shudder
I
to
hadn't
think of
quite
the emissions.
anticipated. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Where is Catherine? Yeah, emissions. Yeah. I'm sure there'll be a very nice little electric boat puttering along, and I will no doubt take out my father's 1953 dinghy with its, even then, second-hand seagull motor, which uses incredibly small amounts of petrol.
Yeah. No,
2-stroke, in
that's
fact.
Great. I'm jealous. That sounds like a great trip. But it has been a heck of a week for news, not least of which the pretty shocking closure of News Hub. 300 journalists and others are going to lose their jobs by the end of June. And we're going to talk to Mark Jennings, a former colleague, former co-founder of Newsroom, but of course, for a long time, the head of news at TV3, which became News Hub. And someone who is old enough to remember the days when there was just one TV news channel. And that's what we're going to have in a couple of months' time. So it'll be
But we
interesting
will
to talk to
have.
him.
I mean, you can imagine. You can imagine Paddy Gower being absolutely brilliant on Substack. And I have perhaps even he'll reach more people. I don't know. I have some ideas about. I mean, Mark has written a kind of what I would do if somebody were dumb enough to try and keep News Hub going, and I've got some ideas about that as well. But there will be a future for some of these people. There will be a future for probably all of them. But I think, without turning this too much into a media program, because we had David Farrier on last week, it is interesting to look at this. And one this week, Bernard, and we won't really have time for this with Mark, but I wanted to raise it with you. The dislike and resentment and mistrust of media in New Zealand appears to me to be quite profound. I have made the mistake, as I did last week, of going into a couple of people's feeds, Sean Plunkett being one of them, and the degree of vitriol and loathing and dislike and preparedness to crap all over people who've just lost their jobs is enormous. And then I made a second mistake last night of going into Michael Bassett's commentary about the media, which was in itself really hideous and a rather mean attack on journalists and journalism. But note, I think it had 130 comments on it below. And these are relatively sensible people. They are signed up to Hobson's Pledge, or at least up to Michael and Don Brash's views. But the level of vitriol and attack on New Zealand media was just extraordinary. And this whole idea of it being bought by the $55 million PIJF, which, as you know, I was involved in originally in the founding of, and it did get rather hijacked, but it most certainly was not a bribe.
Yeah, it's very
I
frustrating.
think
what's happened.
We're pushing shit uphill here, Bernard, against a lot of public hostility, and I know I'm going into some dark places to find it, but there's a lot there.
Yeah, it's extraordinary that it's happened so quickly. Obviously, COVID accelerated the process, and the way that people have migrated so quickly into getting news from all sorts of social media places, and the way that the algorithms for not just the likes of Twitter, X, Facebook, and others have generated some sort of whiplash spiral issue, and it's happened so quickly. I mean,
It is. I was really struck that Luxon, Christopher Luxon, the Prime Minister, raised this question of, apart from saying it's highly unlikely the government would intervene in any way in the News Hub thing, but he said, and the media, of course, has to deal with this issue of choice. He also made it an issue of business, but this issue of trust is the politicians are very guilty, particularly Winston Peters, I would say, of bringing the media into disrepute themselves to weaken the position of media, to question them.
Yeah, and when you're in power, you don't think there's a problem to solve. In fact, if anything, media diversity when you're in power is a problem. It's when you're in opposition that you realise that it's actually quite useful to have large numbers of media for you to talk to and reach and hope to get your message out to a wider public. And at the moment, the government are fairly relaxed about moving to a one TV news channel world. But those people who were around in the days when Robert Muldoon was bullying TVNZ's news editors, and there were all sorts of fights behind the scenes, when to get anything out in New Zealand you needed to basically be connected to a newspaper. It is a different world.
Yeah, we'll miss it when it's, because it's. I think you know this, Bernard, but one of the things that inspired me to become a journalist when I was about 11 was watching Simon Walker take on Prime Minister Muldoon about the New Zealand patrols and his, Muldoon's constant warnings about Russian submarines, and I just found that I'd never seen anything like that. It wasn't 11; I was fractionally older than that, but I'd never seen anything like that where a journalist really took on the politician. Unfortunately, I took that so much to heart that I acted as a most annoying little bull terrier or terrier by the time I was in the lobby, and in the gallery. But I'm over that now.
Sometimes
one other thing
you need some grit. Sometimes you need some grit in the mix to clean things out. And
but you can't bite and bark all the time, especially not when you look like about a 16-year-old school dropout, which I was.
I'm very pleased
speaking
that
of
Hero,
dropping out, Bernard,
Hero has stopped barking, which is great.
Bernard, I heard Wallace Chapman describe you yesterday as an economist. He said, we're going to be joined by independent economist Bernard Hickey. I nearly dropped my glass of wine.
Yes, I have been trained as an economist, and certainly enjoy talking about economics and reading about it. And I am independent, but you're in the strict sense of the word of working with an economics team and having some fancy models and coming up with some forecasts. That's something I don't do. And you're quite
now
right.
You're also turning over another career leaf tonight by becoming a stand-up comic. Right?
Yeah, hopefully I'm going to be sitting
I'm
down.
so impressed.
Yeah, hopefully I'm going to be sitting down. So this is an event I'm going to be at tonight in Auckland at the Basement Theatre with Robbie Nicol, and we're going to talk about the world of the political economy. He's going to be funny, and I'm going to try and be the straight man, and that'll be good fun.
I thought that was my job.
Yeah.
To be your straight man.
Good. No, it's going to be good fun. But news these days, you can find it in all sorts of different places and in different ways. And we're really lucky we've got Catherine Dyer here as our climate
We are
correspondent.
lucky, and we are also lucky that she isn't making us incredibly jealous by being somewhere in Northland.
That's right.
No.
No, you're back in just as warm Auckland. And Catherine, talking of warmth, you've been following the numbers on sea temperatures, air temperatures, and you can become inured to these numbers, but it's just worth remarking just how many records and for how long.
Yeah, so the marine heat wave, the global marine heat wave, is about to turn 1 year old.
Yeah.
So it's started smashing records, not just, it smashed the records by a lot in March 2023. And that has continued all the way through until today in February. It's still well above anything that we've seen before. So it's about to turn 1.
Yes, and one of the factors there is the removal of sulphur from shipping fuels, which seems to be playing out in warmer sea temperatures along those routes. Could you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, there was some new shipping rules in 2020. I think we've talked about these before, and ships were required to remove a lot of the sulphur content from their emissions, and so that reduced them by, I think around 75%. And those sulphur emissions are like aerosols that attract moisture and form clouds and then reflect sunlight coming in. So in some of the heat maps that you can see of the ocean, you can actually see areas like trails where the ships move, where you can see it's become hotter as a result of losing those.
It's an interesting indication,
clouds.
Catherine, of how relatively small changes can have an impact, though. I mean, this is a weird change that was for theoretically positive reasons, has had a strangely negative and quite perceptible short-term effect. What do you think it might say for some of the geoengineering ideas, and how quickly they could have an impact?
Yeah, I mean, some people are saying that actually we've been conducting a geoengineering experiment for the last 100 years, where we've been putting these aerosols into the air, and they've actually been doing that job of reflecting sunlight. And so, and as we reduce that pollution, it's adding to heating in the short term. And so maybe, this is the suggestion of Jim Hansen that maybe we should put some back up there just to cool things down for a while. I don't know. The one thing that is always concerning about, when you start doing that sort of thing deliberately is that there is a price to pay if you suddenly stop doing it. So if you require that to be managed by people and you need it to be stable, then you also need your world to be politically stable and supportive of that, and
that is
it could be a sort of global cane toad problem.
Yeah, right. If you make any sudden changes, then the results could be even more devastating than what they would have been if you'd just left it alone in the first place.
And that's the danger where you start to weaponize your climate solutions. You put them in the hands of one particular power, able to put them up there into the atmosphere, and one way to exercise power is to threaten to stop doing it.
And I think we can know which power that would be the one that's lagged most on fossil fuels. It'll be the United States that'll be doing this, right? And it'll be Exxon and
it'll be
so
tempting for some of them to do it because they think that'll be a cheap way to solve the issues.
Yeah, I don't know that it would even be a particularly difficult thing to do. So I'm not sure that it has to be the most technologically advanced country that does it. It could be any number of places that do it locally or regionally for particular reasons, So
well, India's been talking about doing it for the monsoon, hasn't it? On those years when the monsoon rains don't really work necessarily. Catherine, there was an interesting comment I saw today from Helen Clark related to what's his name? The the deputy leader of the New Zealand First Party, Shane Jones, talking about giving a kind of government indemnity to fossil fuel companies to come back to do exploration to protect them from any future government change. That there would be something in their contracts which allowed them to be compensated if a future government turfed them out. What do we make of this kind of determination? And is there an argument for greater New Zealand independence in fossil fuels? I can see it for gas, but now that we've shut down Marsden Point, that doesn't seem logical that we're going to get any more energy security from it.
Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't look like there's much of an option to restart Marsden Point. I don't know. I guess you could make an argument for just about anything if you try hard enough. But that indemnity,
and we frequently do, yeah.
Yeah, that indemnity clause reminds me a little bit about the interstate agreements we have with trade, where a foreign state can sue your government if they do anything that inhibits corporates from making money, from making profit, which can really throw a spanner in the works of anybody trying to advance kind of environmental causes. I think the problem with that kind of thing is that it shuts down any efforts that people might want to make in the future to reduce reliance
to limit
on fossil fuels.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also this is a double-edged sword for Shane Jones and the current government, that if they choose to take these quite aggressive measures to frankly increase emissions, then the European Union, which plugged in a nice little poison pill into the free trade agreement to say, if we renege on our Paris agreements, we'll shut down this trade agreement. And if you think the European Union are bluffing, then of course you just have to look at the protests from farmers in recent days, and how of course it's convenient for the farmers to lock New Zealand farmers out, and they'll use whatever excuse they can, even if they're not particularly sensitive or in favour of climate action. They're quite happy to use it as an excuse to block imports of competitors. So that can play both ways. Just finally, Catherine, on the issue of mining and pumping stuff into the atmosphere and the connections to GDP growth. We're going to get a report tonight from the United Nations, a 5-yearly report on our resource use. What is it likely to expected to say about how much more stuff we're going to use and pump out as we grow GDP, and whether we can ever disconnect our GDP growth from our emissions growth?
Yeah, so that's the UN Global Resource Outlook report, and they actually did a presentation to some EU ministers about, or last month, ahead of this report coming out. And so some of the headlines have already been reported on. And so they're basically estimating that our resource extraction, raw material resource extraction, is likely to increase another 60% up until 2060. And that's on top of a 400% increase that we've already seen since 1970 of resource extraction. So it's pretty, and this is basically we're rematerializing all of our energy supply chains and our transport systems, and it takes resources to rebuild all of those things differently,
and to shift them from fossil fuels to rare earths and cadmium and everything.
Yeah, there's all sorts of elements to this. Like, for instance, a lot of those resources are
nice,
coming from...
nice pun there. All sorts of elements. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Hopefully that was intentional. If not,
I'm going to do
Of course it was.
I'm going to do that fantastic recitation of the periodic table. If you're not going to.
No, hell's bells. But a lot of that stuff is coming from mining in the middle of conflict zones in developing countries, and that it gets pulled out of there, and then we take it into the global north and use it to transition our energy systems, and then we go to the UN and we look at those countries and wave the finger at them for not keeping up with us in terms of, rebuilding their own energy systems. So it is, there's an element of kind of colonialist type practices going on. And they're also, though, in this report, what they're actually saying is that, the idea that we can decarbonise and decouple economic growth and well-being from all resource use or material throughput and environmental impacts is not very convincing, and that the prevailing focus on cleaning up the supply side, which is focusing on efficiency and intensity and things like that, it needs to be complemented with more demand side measures. And when they say demand side measures, what they're talking about is doing things and putting in place policies to reduce people's demand for the end products that require those resources, which is pretty close to the kind of thing that degrowthers like to.
The final heresy, degrowth.
Yeah. Thinking of the periodic table, and seeing Robert come on, I've been reminded of a wonderful friend of mine whose young son used to call it the patriotic table.
Good fun. And you need to know that periodic table to know what to mine.
Exactly.
This is the important thing.
Well,
yeah.
And as Tom Lehrer said, you've got molybdenum, aluminium. I mean, we should do it. We should definitely. Actually, Robert, when we finally get face to face with Robert, we could do a karaoke of Tom Lehrer's periodic table song.
That's going to be a hit, I can tell. Catherine, thank you very much for jumping on the show today.
See you, Catherine.
Matiwa.
Okay.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Are you changing the world down on Otago down there? Has the new Vice Chancellor turned up in your office to help get you a Dyson to vacuum it and everything? Dust your books?
You might think that, but I couldn't possibly comment. It's an interesting development.
Yeah. So another interesting development.
I think many academic staff are quietly optimistic.
Good. So another interesting development is what the hell is Benjamin Netanyahu doing with this talk of a Ramadan ceasefire, with Biden saying it might happen this weekend, Hamas saying, oh no, it won't, and Netanyahu still talking about total victory. Is this all about putting pressure on the Qataris and Hamas about the hostages, or what? What are you feeling or
it's
picking
very
up
difficult to disentangle it. I agree, and the reason it's so difficult is because the Americans and the Israelis are increasingly saying slightly different things, and Mr. Netanyahu is insisting there will not be a Palestinian state, and he's also insisting that the offensive in Rafah will go ahead. He's also saying that victory is within sight, but he's giving no objective indicators of that.
No.
And, how can you speak about victory when 30,000 Palestinians, many of whom had nothing to do with the events of the 7th of October, which caused this massive and disproportionate military retaliation, are dead, including more than 13,000 children? I haven't heard any apologies from the government of Israel about that.
No, it's a necessary evil.
Their inability to distinguish between civilians and military targets is very worrying. So what we may be witnessing is a bit of posturing by both Mr. Biden and Mr. Netanyahu to try to pull the other one over to their perspective on the way forward. But
because
it's very difficult to disentangle.
Because it does look like that Biden's connections to Netanyahu and support for Israel's actions are really hurting him politically with his own people.
The Michigan, 100,000 uncommitted voters.
And this is a concern for Biden because the latest polls show that in the swing states, Donald Trump is ahead of Biden, and the latest from the Supreme Court suggests that the hopes some sort of legal block might come in before the election seems to be fading. So for Biden, it becomes an existential issue, the support of Israel.
Yeah, but I think Joe Biden believes that he's now facing a terrible dilemma, that if he does use his leverage and say to Netanyahu, that's enough, that's it, we're not supporting you anymore, immediate ceasefire be done, he then worries that he'll get savaged by the Republicans for abandoning an ally at a crucial time, just when they are on the verge of victory. This is why Netanyahu is using this victory rhetoric, not because it's objectively true, but because he's trying to squeeze Joe by putting pressure via the Republican Party. By the way, Mr. Netanyahu has no great love for the Biden administration. So, yeah, I mean, I think Biden feels the only thing he can do is get a temporary ceasefire, given these these perceived constraints, and hope that might lead to something a little bit more permanent. But it you know, I agree with you. You know, sometimes politics is about choosing between difficult choices. I think on balance, Mr. Biden needs to increasingly act with a sense of moral compass and increasingly do the right thing rather than calculations.
Yeah, I thought in the early stages of
Israel.
Sorry, Robert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
No. Sorry, forgive me. I'll get bollocked.
No, I was just going to say, I think he's quite right that he will anticipate that the Republicans would pillar him if he said to Netanyahu, that's enough. America's taxpayers' dollars will not go on for the sort of military campaign you've been engaged in anymore.
No.
You've had your chance. Extraordinary. You've had 4 months to win this, and you haven't done it. So he knows that will draw bitter criticism. On balance, it might just help him salvage a situation politically. I'm not saying it will, because I think a lot of those people who've abandoned Biden, particularly young people, are not going to come back in a hurry.
And in particular, the political problem for Biden is that to win against Trump, he needs big turnout. He particularly needs young voters and young women, because the debate between the Republicans and the Democrats in many states is about abortion. And what's interesting about the change in political attitudes along age groups, not just the United States but around the world, is that young women are increasingly turning liberal and to the left. In many ways, a lot more than young men. And for Biden, he needs those votes. And in particular, because he has a strong argument on the abortion and women's rights issues. But of course, many of those voters are also shocked, deeply shocked at the images they're seeing day after day coming out of Gaza about, the slaughter of innocent children and civilians.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Bernard.
A bit of delay there, I think.
I was just going to say you're absolutely right, because I think that before Gaza came along, Biden was going to use, the abortion issue to actually win quite a lot of Republican women voters, because a lot of Republican women voters are very unhappy about, the Roe v. Wade overturning. And but I think that possibility, that opportunity is closing, because I think while his leverage over the abortion issue is being reduced by what seems to be lack of empathy on a human level. Also, the fact that the United States has found itself at variance with its professed support for an international rules-based order.
Yeah.
You only have to look at Gaza to see what a lawless military campaign that has been. And
I was really struck, Robert, and I did do some digging on it, and I haven't seen it reported really outside quite limited ranges of Arab and Muslim press, was this extraordinary quote from Liquds. I mean, she's not from the extreme right; she's from the Netanyahu party, from the Netanyahu party. May Golan, the Minister of Social Equality, saying, quotes, "I am personally proud of the ruins of Gaza, and that every baby, even 80 years from now, will tell their grandchildren what the Jews did." So we have to understand the depth of this. I think we do understand it very well. The depths of the existential fear that Israelis fear, but that kind of biblical standing on the ruins of Gaza is an extraordinary thing, especially when you've got the IGC both having said there's a plausible case to investigate genocidal intent, and then separately having this case, which Israel's not even bothered contesting, of the Palestinian authority,
which is potentially explosive. The second one,
just explain why. So it's a second inquiry by the international, by the World Court,
the ICJ, into the legitimacy and legality of the occupation since '67.
Why? So why could it be explosive?
I think they may be more inclined. I'm not a legal expert, so I say this tentatively, but I think they may be more inclined. The evidence is much more clear-cut than it is when testing out on genocide, the first case, That is to say, you're exploring, and the successive American presidents have complained publicly about what they've called illegal settlements. Now, they went before the ICJ. What was interesting to me was the American case. They said that it was to declare that the settlements were illegal, although that's what many presidents have complained about.
Yeah.
But legally, they said it was understandable given the security situation that Israel faces. So they're actually not disputing whether the occupation,
the legality
not
or
claiming the occupation is fully legal. They're just saying it's a necessity given the security situation. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that goes down with the judges. But I just want to come back to the other point you raised, Peter, when you quoted that member of the Likud about, taking pride in basically dismantling Gaza in a way that Mr. Putin would have been proud of in places like Mariupol. I think, and this is a point that's being made by many Jewish people in the United States and other European countries, you're not being pro-Israel, being silent when Israel is making its own situation even more insecure.
Yeah.
And killing large numbers of innocent Palestinians does not enhance Israel's security. And it's strange, it's very incongruous for Mr. Netanyahu to talk about victories in sight when they have killed so many innocent Palestinians in the process. That doesn't make it more secure. People who've lost children who had nothing to do with Hamas are not going to be well disposed to Israel in the day after. So,
and Robert, what did you make
in
of
a sense, America, I mean, according to the criticism in the US, many American Jews have said that Mr. Biden should have acted very robustly with Israel, not to not to let Israel down, but to be a true friend. If you itself or doing something harmful to its interests, do you remain quiet?
Robert, Winston Peters, the foreign minister, today announced that Hamas, the political wing of Hamas, was going to be seen as a terrorist organization, the same as the military wing. Then he also did that thing that we've seen others do, which is impose sanctions on a range of Israeli settlers by name who have stirred up trouble in the West Bank. What do you think about the New Zealand position right now? It sounds like we're playing it delicately, but generally following in the wake of others.
Closer alignment with our traditional allies in the Five Eyes and the United States. It's eroding a distinctive New Zealand position. Let's be quite clear about Hamas. It uses terrorism, but it's also a social organisation which is responsible. It is a social movement, and it's a resistance movement. And by the way, non-state actors don't have a monopoly on terrorism. This country itself was the victim of state-sponsored terrorism. So, it's an interesting. It signalled that New Zealand is in the process of aligning more closely, but New Zealand's been strangely tongue-tied about war crimes committed in Gaza. So this is a position where I think New Zealand may be seen by the global South, and even by countries like Ireland, as essentially being a bit selective in its designation of terrorism.
Yeah, Robert, may I ask you, draw you in on a couple of questions on Ukraine, because I have a feeling that we are all at risk after 2 years of the fatigue being partly with us as well, the fatigue about Ukraine, and we kind of see it as not exactly see it as a done deal. But one of the things that at the top of the hour, Bernard and I were talking a little bit about media, some of the dark places that I've been investigating, and including going into one area which was a New Zealand would-be MP for New Zealand First, who is circulating the canard that the CIA deposed Lukashenko Yanukovych in Ukraine, and that the whole Orange Revolution was an American conspiracy. I mean, I've seen that now circulating quite intensely as a sort of meme including, of course, from Tucker Carlson and to some extent from
yes, and
from
the
Elon
Brexiteers.
Musk. Yeah, which is really at a very risky time for supporting Ukraine. Maybe. Do you want to give us a brief?
Yes, and it shows you that New Zealand First may have.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it shows it's an interesting reflection on New Zealand First, because it shows there are currents within that party which echo the stance taken by the pro-Putin caucus in the Republican Party. What they do not point out is this so-called American coup. It wasn't an American coup per se. I think the Americans and many Western countries were quite pleased to see a pro-Russian government led by Yanukovych go. But the circumstances are that a lot of people protested at Yanukovych's U-turn. He negotiated an agreement with the EU for a trade association. Russia said it wouldn't accept it and offered instead a loan of 15 billion, and that infuriated lots of people, and there were widespread demonstrations in which the Yanukovych government was responsible for the killing of 100 people.
Yeah.
So yes, Yanukovych's government was democratically elected, but as we know, democracies and democratic leaders can commit atrocities, and they can abuse their own people.
Well, he was the very definition of
many
a puppet.
You speak to most Ukrainians, and they said Yanukovych went to where he was always working. He fled to Russia.
Yeah, and there's a reason they call it the Revolution of Dignity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned that there's views like that in New Zealand First.
Yeah, I've just seen them step up, both here and in the media overseas, and I just
but
it makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it leaves me feeling uncomfortable as well, but because it's an inconvenient truth. If the circumstances in which Yanukovych lost power, were even seen as murky, let's say they were seen as murky, that is no excuse for an illegal intervention, or invasion I should say, by Mr. Putin in 2022, which tore up the UN Charter. I mean, there's just absolutely, this is just simply a straight land grab. Is people from New Zealand First saying that's okay? It's justified because the government of Yanukovych.
Actually, but Bernard's going to ask you a question about Macron in a minute. But let me just ask on this. Just squeeze one more in, Bernard, because so the New York Times did a very good report this week about a sort of daisy chain of CIA managed or assisted Ukrainian intelligence bases all up and down the front line. Now, that would seem to me to be exactly acting in both Ukraine's interests and American interests. And if we go back to 2014 and go back to the Maidan protests, it is pretty well known that George Soros's organizations supported and gave helped with the Orange Revolution. It also is, the National Endowment for Democracy and to some extent the CIA. There is a dedication there to support democratic movements in the interests of the United States. So rather than seeing this as a conspiracy, it is surely, what their job actually is, in a sense, is to promote democratic outcomes that are both in the interests of the people of each country, but also to some extent in the interests of NATO and the West, and of the rules-based order, as you say. Yes,
and I would add to that really the Ukrainian response to the Russian invasion since February 22 does actually, I think, undermine the argument that the present government is just an unpopular stooge of the Americans. After all, if that really was the case, if Yanukovych was manipulated out of power by the CIA, it doesn't make sense that if they were really all pro-Russian, like Yanukovych, and the whole thing was a top-down CIA plot, then why didn't Ukraine collapse like a house of cards when Mr. Putin in there? It doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me. The fact of the matter is Mr. Putin attempted to annex the whole country, and he failed. And, I think one thing is quite clear. the Ukrainian resistance is pretty comprehensive and it's pretty consistent. And, it seems to me those sort of arguments that external manipulations from the West have led to this situation, that Mr. Putin was provoked into this situation, well, it doesn't sit comfortably with the realities of Mr. Putin's authoritarian regime. He doesn't brook any opposition at home,
No.
as you made quite clear, Peter, in your recent piece in the spin-off. But in addition, his behaviour, his attitude to near neighbours, like Ukraine. And, it seems extraordinary to me that people in democracies excuse the behaviour of dictators, mass murdering regimes.
But all leaders kill, Robert. All leaders kill. That's why Tucker Carlson doesn't want to be a leader. Bernard, you want to ask him about another leader who's run his troops up to the top of the hill and decided to pull them down, not even before they got there.
Yeah, with obviously Ukraine under enormous pressure on the battlefield, running out of shells. We heard some comments this week from Emmanuel Macron, France's president, that he was open to the idea of sending European troops into Ukraine. That comment lasted a few moments before it was blasted away by opposition from Germany, not the least, but others as well. Yeah, what did you make of Macron's intervention, but also the pressure that's now on the members of the European Union around their own defence spending, the risk that Trump gets in, and they're sort of naked in Europe, and even Germany talking about its ability maybe to have some nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mr. Macron has a track record of being a bit of a maverick and floating ideas and then having to abandon them. So this is not the first time he's made statements which he's walked away from. I think it reflects France's long-held view, which has been articulated by that there are limits to which Europe should depend on the United States. And, France has consistently argued that Europe needs an army, quite independently of NATO, a European army. But the Germans, of course, have indicated that while they're happy to support the Ukrainians, they do not, I think probably, and there's a lot of history involved here, want to have German forces.
Yes, rather
less, of course. Unless, of course,
maybe
Russia expands out of the Ukraine.
Yeah, Robert, did you see the rather extraordinary comment by Oleg Scholz, the German Chancellor, who slightly put his foot in it when talking about the sending of European troops, when he pointed out that I don't know, I'm not sure many people knew this, that there are British troops in Ukraine helping the Ukrainians run the Storm Shadow long-range missiles, which did not go down tremendously well with the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's I'm sure it didn't. But, Germany's facing a tough decision itself over, as we were speaking last week about this, apparent commitment to start sending tourist missiles. That's still shrouded in
Well, that's what he was.
ambiguity,
That's essentially what he was saying was be careful what you wish for. If we send tourists, we might have to send, as the British have done, troops to actually help.
It's interesting, though, because I think both Germany and France, in their different ways, are facing up to the prospect of presidency. America will not be able to support Ukraine. And are they prepared to allow Putin to win? And I think both of them, although in different ways, have said no. It's just that I think Germany prefers NATO becoming stronger and much more assertive and trying to give Ukraine the tools to do the job. I think Mr. Macron was probably laying it on a bit thick, and he backed away from it by saying, and if necessary, we'll back that up with our own troops. But I think that's clearly that's not going to wash with the Germans. And Germany is in a strong position. It's the second biggest provider of heavy weaponry to Ukraine after the United States. So it's going to have a big say in the approach. But there's a bit of jostling between the French and the Germans. How do they face up to this situation?
Yeah. On another point of conflict that we've talked about, and I'm just partly because Mark Jennings is coming up to talk in the section we're doing
Sure.
on New Zealand media in a minute. Newsroom's Sam Sachdeva has done not a bad piece about what the New Zealand troops are doing, or New Zealand forces are doing in the UK, helping train the Ukrainian troops. Of course, we still don't know exactly what New Zealand the sort of. You could probably fit them in the back of a trekker, but the number of New Zealand people who have been sent probably to do intelligence work and targeting work with the Americans and the British on the Houthi. What do you make of the story, which would appear to have originated in Israel, of claims that the Houthis are attacking or are threatening to attack internet cables across the Red Sea, which carry something like 7% of all global internet traffic? Which was interesting that the Yemeni government denied that, which of course then they're not normally in a position of defending the Houthis. What's going on there, do you think?
Well, it's interesting, is it? The Houthis do not seem to be deterred by airstrikes from the United States, the UK, even when they're insisted by, countries like Australia and New Zealand. And I think they are trying to sort of raise the stakes by saying you've really got to respond with a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and if necessary, we're going to escalate further. And I think this is just an indication they're not going to back off. And it may be just, let's be quite clear, it may be just a bellicose bit of bluffing. And I agree with you that I don't think the Yemeni government can actually restrain them anyway. So it's a difficult situation, but it shows once again that the Gaza situation has enormous potential for spreading instability right across the Middle East with global ramifications. That would be a disaster if those cables were cut, clearly.
Absolutely. Robert, thank you so much. You're most welcome to stay on in the background there, because I think Mark might be saying some interesting things in his job application to run the legacy business of NewsHub. Burden, take it away. Hi, Mark.
Mark, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon. It is lovely to see you. It's been a busy few days for you, and a sort of a shocking few days as well. I mean, can you tell us about how you heard about the closure of NewsHub, and it's sort of one of your babies in a way. So how did you feel about it?
Yeah, well, look, I heard staff were being called to a must-attend meeting. Well, that's never a good sign. And that the meeting was up the road from Flower Street at the Dalmatian Community Centre. That's another not so good sign.
That's the people from Croatia, not the dogs.
Yes.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. And it's quite a focal point close to Flower Street, where TV3's headquarters is. And of course, then Glenn Kine and Kylie Elsom, who's the head of HR, essentially had tears in their eyes. So the staff knew immediately that this was not going to be good news. I mean, people have asked me whether I'm surprised. I wasn't surprised that something was going to happen. It had to happen. I've been writing about this for a while, really. You can't keep losing 30 million a year and have things stay the same. So something was going to happen. I think the shock and surprise is the closing the whole show down. What I expected would be a severe trimming and, some major cost cuts made, but I did not expect the balloon to go up completely like it has.
Mark, I wanted to ask too about the old days, if you like. A lot of our listeners and readers may not remember the days when we only had one TV news channel. And I think it's relevant because it looks like we're going to go back to the days of having one TV news channel. Now, you were instrumental in building up the TV3 news operation, and coming in at a time when there was this quite active competition, very, very competitive. Can you talk about why competition matters for the news business? Because you've been right in there with it.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Bernard. It's been a gloves off, full on knockout competition from day one in 1989 when we started. maybe it's got a bit more gentlemanly over time, but it was pretty intense when I started. But what it did immediately was TVNZ lifted its game straight away, to the point where they tried to smack us out and put us out of business. We, of course, did not have the same resource as they did. They were down in a luxury building in Hobson Street, and we were in a crappy old butter factory up in Flower Street. And if you ever went into Three's newsroom, politicians used to say to me, John Key particularly, "Boy, I see you're not spending any of your money on surroundings." And you've probably all been in the building, including Robert. So what this did, though, was that we had a great esprit de corps that developed from being the scrappy loser in the ratings, So our benchmark became, I guess, I was going to say outstanding journalism. I might be overrating ourselves a wee bit there, but we really benchmarked ourselves on journalism and winning each day at a time. And that's when we started to make progress on One. But One, to their credit, kept trying to lift their game. And the great thing about competition, I think, particularly for journalists, we thrive on competition. It's in our DNA. It's what motivates us. Each night we used to look at both screens. The whole newsroom would be still there at 6 o'clock. Nowadays, people clear off once they've done their story, but not then. The whole newsroom stayed, and we all stood and watched. And if somebody had got beaten, nobody really said anything, but nobody needed to. It was what it was. So,
Mark, what do you make of the current situation, though? Because it was interesting to me. I mean, you've come up with a plan to fix it and to slim it down and so on, and that might be accepted. I have a plan for it too, which I'll tell you about in a minute publicly.
Let me get my hands on it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Bernard will just put it on Substack and call it the New Zealand Housing Journal.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
In terms of quality, I was saying to Bernard, we had a session at the very top of this podcast about the extent to which there has been, on the right in particular, real glee at the destruction of News Hub. Lots and more allegations about the Public Interest Journalism Fund. There's a real dislike of journalism and journalists that is getting fed out there. Whether it's widely held, I don't know, but I'm certainly seeing a lot of it. And then you had Christopher Luxon also saying that, apart from the comment that the government was unlikely to intervene in any way, but that media had to do something about the trust factor. What was News Hub editorially strong enough, quality enough in the last while? I mean, I'm not talking about its married at first sight stuff, but there's been some criticism also of its news output.
Yeah. It's a difficult question to answer, Peter, particularly because a lot of my friends and colleagues are involved in this. But I think what we saw is a kind of winding down. I mean, they've had this sinking lid policy. They've delayed shows. The motivation of journalists when that starts to happen, and when you get to celebrating, that's a good piece to camera, or that's quite good. To my mind, no, you only celebrate it when you smash the competition. So it's a bit like everybody gets, a prize or something. That's not how the Crusaders play rugby. You know. So
Mark, you started the week though. Just before this happened, you started the week at the centre of a small storm created by Cyclone Winston Peters, who, weirdly, of course, was one of the few politicians who came out yesterday and said that this is there's a risk to diversity here. But Mark, you were at the centre of an alleged conspiracy of elite news leaders, which is usually you and me, sometimes very occasionally meeting at the Gypsy tea rooms. And I have no power. You have some power to decide whether Winston would be, quotes, cancelled. Would you like to just address that? I mean, did you misspeak? Is he being an arsehole? What's going on there?
But
we're allowed to use words like arsehole here that you wouldn't use at Newsroom.
Well, the word cancelled is ridiculous. So how this came about was at the end of a 20-minute podcast on the Detail. I posed a question to Peter Thompson, a Wellington academic, that there had been some talk amongst journalists and senior journalists that, maybe we should just, stop reporting Winston when he says the media is corrupt and takes bribes. But it was just talk. And I put it to Peter and he went, no, well, that's a stupid idea, obviously. But, where I've clashed with Winston on this is I get really pissed off when he keeps going on about this corruption and bribes. And, he's suggesting illegality here, yet he won't say where this illegality actually is and who's doing it, of course. So, I mean,
do you regret, Mark, the impact of the impact of the PI of the Public Interest Journalism Fund that's allowed this to flourish?
Yes, I do a bit, Peter. Unfortunately, I do. The fund was really well-intentioned. It produced 95,000 pieces of journalism. There wasn't one complaint upheld against those 95,000. It kept a lot of journalists, particularly regional journalists, of which we employed 3, in jobs, and those communities serviced with news. It was really instrumental in fostering Maori journalism and training generally, and to see what a certain section of people have managed to paint it as, I find really disappointing. So I'm a defender of it, and I've no qualms calling Winston out. This is just not true, and he knows it, even though, and to see him turn around within the space of a day and say,
I thought that was a pretty good 180 actually, bit of a handbrake turn.
Yeah,
from Mr. Handbrake.
But doesn't it show what a skilled politician he is? Because Melissa Lee and Luxon look stupid with their responses to News Hub's demise. Winston at least looked like a person with some empathy.
Let me ask you. So just very briefly, because I'm going to tell you mine as well, and that's not why I want you to be brief. But your proposal is that News Hub should shrink and do less better. Is that right?
Do less
better. Like still do a news program. Do a half-hour evening current affairs show to go up against the editorial on TVNZ.
Yes. So 2 things about that. You've got to have differentiation in the market. So when just as I was taking over at 3, my predecessor Rod Peterson decided, it was after the Iraq War, where we had done hour-long bulletins. He decided to stay at an hour, and the ratings started going up. So TVNZ immediately went to an hour as well, and that stopped our growth. I think there's a place in the market for a half-hour news bulletin here. And when you've got a really slimmed down organisation, that is enough airtime. And you can do the news in that airtime. You do all the important stuff, that's for sure. And then I think there is a place for a daily current affairs show, but a lightly staffed one that is based around mainly hard interviews. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know whether Ryan Bridge is totally up to that, but I reckon he should have a go at it and give it a go. And we'll see whether he's up to it or not. then basically you then are just stripping back to a digital. That's your on-air component, and you strip back to a digital news service after that. You move the whole lot to some nondescript place in suburbia, and you get on with it, and you do it with without a lot of highly paid presenters. And
you mean somewhere just off Kings and off New North Road?
Yeah.
But Mark, let me ask you one question as well, because Warner Brothers Discovery also owns CNN, and when I was at CNN, we made a series of joint ventures: CNN Czech Republic, CNN Philippines, CNN Poland. I think there is CNN Greece. Some of them are being. CNN Philippines was just shut down about 3 weeks ago. Do you think that CNN brand could have a role in creating some kind of digital news product in New Zealand that had the advantage of the CNN brand sitting behind it?
Yeah, well, I'm really surprised that Warners haven't tried to leverage their muscle into this market. They do have CNN. They also have HBO Max, which sits over on Sky. So I honestly don't know why they bought Three. It puzzles me. They paid $20 million for an outfit that's losing $30 million, and they seem to have had no plan or strategy to turn that around. So. And now we've ended up in this mess. But I think there's one other factor in this, is that advertising agencies and big companies need, at least in the short term, to support NewsHub. If there's a feeling in the community that we need to keep this, because if you cut the cost back pretty much to the bone and you brought more advertising in, I think Warners would find it very hard to suddenly mount their argument that it's closing.
Just finally, from me, Mark, there is a devil's advocate argument here to say, hey, there's been a lot of struggle and fear in the last, 5 or 6 years in media, but over that time we've had some amazing new competitors grow, including the likes of Business Desk, Newsroom, which I'm certainly really proud of. It's made a huge impact. The spin-off, many others. Maybe this is just the natural, birth and death of organisations, and nature will heal.
Yep.
There'll be something that come up.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is a very relevant point. And Sean Plunkett put that to me today as well. And he puts himself in that mix too, of course. So I guess though look, we are, Bernard, as you know, we are proud of what we've done with Newsroom, and so is Duncan with Spinoff. But I was talking to Duncan today about this, and these are still kind of subscale businesses though, to some degree. And whether, like, for instance, okay, let's say 200 people go at NewsHub. Spinoff, us, and a few other platforms combined would still not take more than be 20% of that size of that newsroom. So yeah, we're good at what we do, and I think we'll see probably more. And of course, somebody, Peter, you just mentioned Substack, and journalists like yourself, Bernard. There's openings totally for that. But I think there's something about having also big, powerful newsrooms. So when we have the earthquakes that wreck a city in Christchurch, we have COVID, we have all these big events. That's when you also need some big newsrooms to be in play. So, yeah, but I do take the point. I think, I hate to be sort of parroting Luxon here, but yeah, there will be, the market will throw up new options. I agree.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on to the show, and I really appreciate your time on what was a busy day. Just finally, I wanted to throw it to Robert, who looks at how democracies thrive and die and the role of media and all of that. What do you make of it as someone who tries to understand how public life develops and whether the bastards are kept honest?
Well, I think it's a very disappointing development. I echo much of what Mark said. There's some excellent people at News Hub, and we've got some excellent, media sources. But I go back to the point about competition. I think, someone who's not a media specialist as such, but have had a fair amount of contact with people in the profession, there's some really excellent people in the profession, and I think it's vital that there is a successor to News Hub in some shape or form, because I think it's important that we don't, in terms of big newsroom, we only have, if there's only one, I think as a democracy, and a growing democracy, I mean, we're a country of more than 5 million people, and it's likely that we'll be a lot bigger in the next decade, possibly 7 million by 2040. I think it's important that there is competition, real competition in the area of media. And some of the issues really do need to be interrogated. Some of the big issues facing this country. And that's more likely to happen, I think, when we've got more diversity, rather than less.
Robert, thank you very much. Lovely to have you
Mark.
on.
And now to the skateboarding dog.
Skateboarding dog, Peter, go for it.
Yeah, just because we've got to lighten things up. And what I loved about the story was that there's a couple of whales who've put the hump into humpback, which is that for the first time, a pair of humpback whales have been found making love, or in this case, more rooting, really, I suspect, as we might call it here on.
That sounds like an awful lot of splashing.
It does. Well, they did it quite deeply, as it were, and apparently they have a genital slit in which they keep their, very much like us with our Speedos, Bernard. They have a genital slit that keeps their penis tucked away for speed and swimming capability. But some observers noted two boy male humpback whales having sex with each other, which of course is a kind of an interesting story in its own right. I don't think they had cocktails before, but apparently, as we know actually with dolphins, I think homosexual behaviour, as the Guardian writes, is common in the animal kingdom and has been spotted amongst dolphins and orca whales, but never previously between humpback whales. But of course, this is the first time that any kind of sex, whether it's gay sex or procreative sex or just, a bit of an afternoon route when you're swimming from one place to another. But it's quite an interesting story.
Yes, I shudder to think if there are pictures. It's amazing what you can do with drones these days. Peter,
Yes,
thank you
exactly.
very
Well,
much.
keep your Speedos on, Bernard, and you'll be swimming and doing other things as well. Well, hopefully not, actually.
Wonderful to see you. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all in a week's time. Ka kite ao now, everyone.
Bye-bye, Bernard.